and are not so open, especially behind closed doors. If you don't understand who you are, you cannot teach your children, your loved ones, and others about who they are if they are of black consciousness. And believe me, I say personally, it has opened many a door for me, and has probably stopped a lot of doors from closing not on my finger but on my head, literally, by figuring again, well, the man's got some brains, some smarts, maybe we better let him slide for this time. So I only hope that it has been worth your while. And our final segment hopefully will bridge a gap and add to the dimensions of black consciousness which already you were raising and which you have definitely added to. We look at the Afro-American, the black man, the people carrying melanin into America in its final stages. And as we looked at the Americas last week and saw extensively that South America is peopled with persons from Africa, and that most of the Americas had, way before Columbus, people living here. We want to look now at what happened after Columbus, so-called, after Abu Bakr, after the people from Mali had come here, after the fall of the Songhai Empire and the migrations to Australia and to the Americas of these people. And I want to start with the decimation of the Indies and simply add to something that you may have heard before. As I've stressed, the people that came from the West Indies here are the same people that came from Africa here. There's no change at all. Although the dialects now from the Indies, whether they be from Port-au-Prince or whether they be from any of the islands, I guess, that are in that strain, which they've come to be known again as the Hispaniolic Islands, they all came from the same place or same places in Africa. It's just that some were taught and maintained by people from France, and some were taught and maintained by people from Portugal, and some were taught and maintained by people from Spain, and some by England, and then some of them actually had to travel a little bit and become educated even more in that school system before they came here. But remember basically, because this will serve you in arguments and so on and so forth, the original people of the Indies were killed off. Genocide was committed. In fact, it was pandemicide. It was just such a high degree of killing and slaughtering. Those people are gone. Only history points out that they possibly were the same Negritos of which we've talked about so much. They had to repopulate them. And the first seeding didn't work because they brought some of the so-called Indians here from America back there, and as usual, and then they brought even a few Chinese. But the people that populated it again, or repopulated it, were the people from Africa. So therefore, there is no difference when you're talking about people, again, from the West Indies or people from Africa. Then, after they stopped there, they brought in mass of people here. From the time of the great fights and battles that went on, as I pointed out to you, there were over 400 of them. And as we still know, there's still uprising, there's still insurgents, there's still questioning, there's still unrest amongst its native black population here in this land, as opposed to what is called the Caucasian ruling principle. But achievements were made at the same time. And those achievements started from day one. Remembering again that the first patent, can anybody actually remember that date when the first patent was granted or issued to a black person? Here's the way you can associate it. My name is what? Blair. What's the first name? Delbert Blair. Okay. Some of you, by the way, call it Dale, D-A-L-E. D-A-L-E is Del, D-E-L. It's short for Delbert. Del Blair. Henry T. Blair was granted the first patent in the United States. And that's the way you can make reference to it. Don't say Del Blair was now, because that might really put me into an antiquarian stage. But Henry T. Blair was granted that first patent. It was for the corn harvester machine, or called the corn planter. And it was November 14th, 1834. November 14th, 1834. Before that time, whatever things were invented, designed, or whatever by persons carrying melanin, they had no credit for it and could easily have been stolen. We'll see fact, let's not wait to see, because I find that this usually causes for a lot of discussion, and when I present this at the end, just before our black presidents, as I do, sometimes you don't get a chance to really discuss them. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. Since we're talking about that, I'm going to go over some of the inventions as of now, starting now, that were done by Afro-Americans in the United States of America. And I'm going to give, in some cases, if you have reference for them, patent numbers. If not, I'll just simply tell you what they did. Now, I don't have patent numbers for all, but I've got patent numbers for about 28 of them. Yeah. Understand, too, that of all the inventions by black Americans, and I want you to hear this very carefully, 37 of them are by one man, Granville Woods, an electrical genius who still, I don't think, is recognized for his genius enough. His name is beginning to be used over the last decade as a person in Afro-American history that should be known, but I still don't think enough emphasis is placed on his name. 25 of them by Elijah McCoy, and 18 of them by Dr. George Washington Carver, which means that of all of that, 80 of those inventions, we'll talk maybe about 125 of them, 80 of those are by 3 men. And as I pointed out, I've lectured at many universities and college, and at some of the best ones, Notre Dame, University of Illinois. I say best ones because of the prestige consciousness of Notre Dame and Big Ten of Illinois and so on like that. Lectured out east at various universities and colleges. When I have lectured to them about black history, anytime it comes down to the inventions, inventors, and scientists that were Afro-American and the number of their inventions, I've never had over 4 named. Never had over 4 named. And these are university and college students whose brains and memories are constantly being tested, which means if they were told this and it was important and they were tested on it, they would know. Which means that the system lacks the ability to want to teach and to enforce and reinforce the teaching of black history. When I have asked, again, name me some black scientists and inventors, invariably the name Dr. George Washington Carver is raised, and because they don't want to appear ignorant, they try their best to say, well, what did he invent? And I think you've heard me say this before. At Notre Dame University, they said he invented the peanut. And as I've stated many times before, only the Creator, or God, I think, can invent the peanut. And then at another place, they said the peanut butter. These are colleges. I guess in some cases, there may have even been graduate program students here. I don't know. But they were all at least 4-year undergrad students. And these kind of things. This is usually the answer I get after I pose 2 questions prefacing that, and that is, name for me in 1 minute's time all of the black songwriters or singers or entertainers and the songs generally associated with them, or the group, or their best-selling record album. And you can imagine when you give that kind of latitude in 1 minute's time, the whole place just lights up. People are screaming and yelling out and laughing, and of course they usually reach, the best ones reach about 32. This might be with a group, say, of 600, 700 people or more. Then I ask, of course, for the black athletes and their sport and team, if you can. And, of course, the house raises again. And then, of course, I ask for black inventors and scientists, but you must also give me their invention. It's real quiet. And tick goes on. People, getting hyper because why am I testing them like this? I'll start off then with a person by the name of Dr. George Washington Carver, a research scientist, a mathematician, a theoretician at Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee, Alabama. And I might also tell you that that was not his real name, Dr. George Washington Carver. Most people don't know that. They changed his name to Dr. George Washington Carver. His name was Tawanga Carter, Tawannng, Tawannng, Tawanga Carver, who later was called Dr. George Washington Carver. Dr. George Washington Carver didn't die until 1943, which meant that he came halfway almost into the century, and yet people are still not familiar with what this man did. From the peanut, he did not invent it, from the peanut, he came up with a process for making instants. And once he dehydrated and made instant peanut, if you would say, dehydrated peanuts, he carried over this process and experimented with coffee and all kinds of corn meals, and was the forerunner of the instant products here in the United States, drying them out and serving them instantly. That is your man that first did this. He came up with all kinds of bleaches. Some bleaches, as he was trying to work for an odorless bleach, and in so doing, he used a lot of resins and herbals to put into the bleach, so he came up with specialized bleaches for various things. Even for skin, did he come up with certain bleaches. He came up with tan removers, all types of wood fillers, if you've ever tried to repair woodworking or furniture. He came up with metal polishes, and there were 8 in all, and I'm finding out now that he did something using a lemon and a oil from what is this, can't think of this particular, cola nut. And they're saying now that whatever that one was, they can't duplicate it. But it supposedly could resist not only water and oils, but even acids to a degree, not completely to a degree. And I'm just doing research on that now. He came up with paper, what they call synthetic paper. A paper that was not available from the regular plants and so that were being imported from the Pacific Islands, because during World War II and the beginning of the time there, a lot of people were not able to get a lot of paper because it was part of what's called the war effort. Came up with shaving creams and rubbing oils, and the last 3 I definitely want you to pay attention to. He came up with a type of linoleum that is still being used. Before that time, they used to have linoleum that was so hard that you couldn't put it in rolls, and it would crack. It would crack in the winter, it would become brittle, and it would just run everywhere in the summer, and would break heat, couldn't resist anything. And in fact, Congolium, which they call the Congolium company, called Congolium Narn, was one of the first ones to use Dr. George Washington Carver's process and come up with the kind of rolled linoleum that we see everywhere now. He also came up with a form of plastic, and that type of textile strip plastic is still being used. And if you know now, plastics are made from little plastic bags all the way to die-cast plastic you can sit on and jump on. That whole idea of converting plastics and making different things from them was granted by Dr. George Washington Carver. And the last one you must remember, because people seem to have forgotten this, during World War II, at the beginning stages of it, after the Pearl Harbor thing into 41 and 42, the United States had a rubber shortage. Again, because the islands that were held by Japan would not let rubber loose to the United States war effort. And it meant that the caissons and the troop carriers and cargo ships, anything that was using rubber, mainly for tires, there was a lack of it. And the United States war effort was grinding to a halt. They were becoming very frightened because once the tires would wear out that they had, they couldn't retread them because they could not get rubber. George Washington Carver invented synthetic rubber. Synthetic rubber. Almost gave the patent away. I understand he didn't even get $3,000 for that effort, but simply told him to send some monies down to the research team at Tuskegee, Alabama Institute, and whether or not they ever got it, I'm not even sure. That itself should have made him a multi-millionaire at that time. Synthetic rubber. He also got into what they call fiber optics. He was doing research in what we now classify as fiber optics. He was doing research in what they call other forms of ice cream other than the dairy products, because he felt that some people would be, black people, because of the lack of lactic acid, could not process a lot of the dairy products. So he experimented with ice cream from roots. And one of his favorite plants was a burdock plant. He made a lot of burdock ice cream, which was sold around Tuskegee like mad, and people were buying it. He also invented the first nylon stocking that could last past one wear. Now, we hear about nylon stockings, and we contribute that to everything but Dr. George Washington Carver. And research is still going on because the man came up with so many inventions and so many patents and took so very little for them. These were like nothing to him. And yet on record are all these things attributed to Dr. George Washington Carver, and they say, what did he do? He invented the peanut and peanut butter. From the soybean, he came up with soy flour, breakfast foods, milk. One of one of the Loma Linda Industries took a lot of his ideas for soybeans and made one of the first, what they call meat substitute production companies. Loma Linda was one of the first because they were owned by the Seventh-day Adventists. And now, of course, we understand soy products and soybean substitutes are just used by most vegetarians. Again, Dr. George Washington Carver. From the sweet potato, he made over 530 different kinds and shades of dyes to replace the aniline dyes that used to come out of Germany. And of course, during the war effort, Germany stopped sending to America. So George Tawning Carver is a man who should be restudied, and I think if he made an error, it was in judgment. He was a very spiritual man, a very God-fearing man, and he did not seem to understand, as most geniuses don't, the climate and tenure of the land in which he lived. He did not get enough money for it, and he did not give it back to the people who he represented. He looked upon people as all people, as spiritual people, as human beings, and what he felt that God gave to him, he should share. Many people, of course, don't feel that way, and unfortunately, because of this, Dr. George Washington Carver died a fairly poor man. And with the riches he could have had, they asked him to sit on boards everywhere. But again, he said he stayed in Tuskegee, he stayed with his God, and he tended his own ways with the herbs and roots and scents. So I want to mention that because sometimes I don't think enough emphasis is placed on the genius of Dr. George Washington Carver. Also, I want to share with you some other inventions and inventors, and you've heard most of these, so I will not spend a lot of time. If there are any you want to go back to, at the end of that, we'll go back to it. For sugar refining process, Norbert Rillieux. Again, Dr. Charles Drew for blood banks and blood plasma, the first ones to put in blood banks in England. As you've heard many times, he died just recently, about 20 years ago, in an automobile accident because they would not give him blood, because it was a white person's blood. And he had stated when they first began to talk like that he no longer was going to be associated with it because that was ridiculous. And ironically enough, that's why he died. He died. Andrew Beard for the railroad coupling machines, and what he referred to as the Jenny coupler. That was in 1897, and he only received $50,000 for that. Before that time, people used to stand up and drop iron spikes into the tie bars between the railroad cars, and if the spike bounced out, it would break teeth, break hands, everything else. Many fingers got crushed. But then the automatic coupler, which we see even on little railroad cars now, and toys at Christmas, all the way to the ones that run now. Again, Andrew Beard. Garrett Morgan, stoplight, gas mask, and also some photoelectric devices that were used in mines, which again he had only half a patent because he shared that invention seemingly with a white man, and he never got his full credit for that one. Benjamin Banneker, and of course he did what I always like to ask when I'm with all the kids now, talk about Benjamin Banneker. Right? Architect, okay. Okay, the map for Washington, D.C., and actually the laying out of Washington, D.C., especially the Capitol buildings and the rotunda, as they call it. And also the first man to invent in the United States the gonging hour clock. Not the clock, the one that strikes the hour. Yeah, the same man, Benjamin Banneker. Daniel Hill Williams, of course, first open heart surgeon, but before that, after that, he also made various slides and prints of the human heart, sectioning it out, and its distribution was made into slides which were circulated amongst most of the research hospitals and pre-med students. Ernest Just, also a biologist and an educator, and he's the one that also got into a lot of the amoeba, basic protozoa studies, many of the plates and stain slides that are used now, and the research that went into basic biology, starting with the amoeba and protozoa class, also because of Ernest K. Just. John Ernst Maltzeliger, that sounds just like a beautiful black man right from Mississippi, or right from the west coast of Africa, right? John Ernst Maltzeliger. Well, again, that's a shoe lasting machine. And that's the machine that ties the hard sole to the soft instep and allow people to not break their feet by tying it on, and yet not hurt their soles of their feet because they could walk on glass and so on like this. Theodore K. Lawless is recognized as the probably greatest dermatologist in the last 35 years. He was a philanthropist because he made so much money. In many cases, he worked right down here at 43rd and King Drive, which is still one of the Lawless buildings. You can see it there. And of course, he built Lawless Gardens. He was also didn't even name it after him. He donated, again, $500,000 to have this dermatological clinic built in the state of Israel. And it's now called the Beilinson, some call it Beilinson Hospital in Israel. It's not even named after him. To get into some things we usually don't hear about, when we talk about Dr. Percy Julian, we're talking about a man who, from the soybean, extracted a arthritis relief serum. And this substance called sterols, of course, is what a lot of the athletes are now using, and which he was using at that particular time to give some relief to arthritic victims. It was much better than the so-called cortisone, a direct steroid that was used from the testes of bulls and animal bile, which many people had harsh reactions to, and really began to cause jaundice in many cases because it affected the liver and the spleen. And so it was a way of giving relief to people who could not get relief before because of the animal substances. And of course, many people were allergic to this. But what we don't hear about Percy Julian is his association with what is called the Manhattan Project. Anybody ever heard of the Manhattan Project? Okay, what's that?
Dealing with separating the atomic body.
Okay, it was the thing that led to the making of the atomic bomb. And Dr. Percy Julian was really the head of that project. He was the brains behind it. Whether that's good or bad, that's very nefarious, but that's the truth. We're told that Enrico Fermi and Fermi Labs, and of course they have Fermi Institutes on many of the university campuses throughout the world now, in honor of Enrico Fermi, an Italian. Enrico Fermi was not the brains behind the Manhattan Project. Enrico Fermi was one of the brains associated with the Manhattan Project. Most people associated at that time will state that when they had problems in chemistry, when they had problems in quantum physics, when they had problems, period, the man that they went to see was Theodore K. Lawrence, who they considered a genius, again, along this line. And of course, we know, I'm sorry, not Theodore K. Lawrence, Percy Julian. And we consider him, of course, as known for the arthritis thing, but nothing to do with his great chemical background and physical science background and working with the Manhattan Project. We look at the fuel injection system, which caused the Volkswagen to begin to outsell American cars when it was first introduced, and started the idea of importing cars from Europe to be sold here in the United States. It was mainly because of the way the Volkswagen sold. And what first sold the Volkswagen outside of its price was the fuel injection system, which they considered to be a more compatible, more efficient type of gas jet carburetor usage, and made the old carburetors kind of obsolete. Most cars now still use a fuel injection system, especially if you're going into turbos, because the other is so inefficient, it burns less gas. I mean, it burns more gas. He tried his best, this particular man, Daniel George, to sell his idea to the American manufacturing automotive companies and industries, and they refused it. They would not pay him half of what he wanted, and he said, so be it. He tested the foreign market, Volkswagen company bought it, and the rest is history. When we look again to things in history that are not well known, we understand that Frederick Jones, who died in '61, invented the refrigerated cars that are now used in railroading and are now used in over-the-road transportation. So you have both of those 18-wheelers and the 4-wheelers, and you also have them again on railway cars, that refrigeration car. You find that Lewis Temple was a man who came up with a double-edged harpoon, which was much more efficient at whaling and spearing on the high seas. We know that Lewis Latimer, which I've spent some time with both on the radio show and at a lot of schools and colleges, but Lewis Latimer is the real brains behind the Edison Company. And as I've stated many times, if the truth ever comes out about Thomas Edison, then we'll have to say that he is probably one of the more interesting figures of our time to have done so very little and got so much credit. Thomas Edison, of course, when you really read his history, only had 3 months of formal education. 3 months of formal education. He supposedly patented over 1,100 inventions. Now, he could have been that blessed, yes, but history finds he was not that blessed. His real people behind him was Louis Latimer, Granville Woods, and Nikolai Tesla. Two of those three are black men, Granville Woods and Louis Latimer. It is because of those prolific inventors that Edison was able to do anything. And it's interesting, too, that Black Enterprise magazine last year had a full-page article there with a faded picture of Thomas Edison in a thoughtful position, stating again, how did I try to superimpose that? Just paraphrasing, it was something like, again, you know, if at first you don't succeed, try again. But I think it was something like, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I think they attribute that to Edison. And truly that was his, because he invented very little, but he sure did scheme to get it. So I guess he did perspire a lot. So I think that really applies to him, but it's not the way that they are presently using it about Thomas Alva Edison. When we look at that whole picture, we understand that Louis Latimer, who was an inventor, a draftsman, an engineer, who was Howard Latimer, wrote the book for the Edison Company explaining how to make and install electric lights, because nobody else could get the job done. Not only did he have to write the book, he had to then go out to personally supervise the installation of electric lights in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and go overseas to London, England. Before that time, they were not lit up. He is the one that taught them how to get sophisticated lighting apparatus that the Edison Company so-called invented. He went over there and supervised it, and had, as he even said on some occasions, go out into the field, as they call it, out into the streets, and hand do it, because the people still couldn't understand some of the blueprints and some of the schematics that the Edison Company was using that he had written. He was also, oh, and by the way, too, if you want to write it down, he was granted the patent for the carbon filament. He was granted the patent for the carbon filament, and it is the carbon filament that made the electric light go. All the other bulbs, whatever filamentation they used, couldn't last too long, couldn't stand up, and burned out. He was granted, again, that particular patent. And that particular patent is number 252386. 252386, for the manufacture of all carbons used in the electrical industry. That's the way it was granted to him. Granville Woods, as I stated, is another genius of our time. And possibly soon you're going to start hearing more about him, I'm sure, as more time is spent really digging into so-called black history or Afro-American history again. He invented the third rail, which is used still extensively, still used in our own subway system, the railroad telegraph, and just many, many, many devices. But what I want to harp on is that he was so prolific an inventor that he sold electrical devices to Bell Telephone. He sold electrical devices to General Electric. He sold electrical devices to Westinghouse. And you tell me if that isn't the backbone of the American electronic industry. Westinghouse, Bell, AT&T, and General Electric. He is the man they went to first for his inventive genius. Edison actually sued Granville Woods in court 3 times and lost all 3 cases. They could not prove that he stole from them, and that's what they offered. The last time he got angry, he sued them and won $1.5 million. That's not in your history books too much, but it is a fact. Again, the name Granville Woods. We look at so many things, run through a few, because actually we could stay here for 2 hours talking about, we got into some of the stories behind it, the inventions of Afro-Americans and the little known profit that came to them from it, and the little known recognition that has come to them because their own people, of course, still don't know. We talk about the preparing for hair. Black people have always been interested in getting their hair looking good. And you can just about figure that all kind of things were invented you probably ever knew about. For herbs, some of them probably never even copywritten or processed. But A.P. Ashburn came up with a process for preparing coconut for domestic use. And that process has been used in coconut shampoos and oils and everything else again. A man by the name of Bond, B-A-U-N-N, C-O Bond, because many of these people did not have first names, they only went by initials when they were registered there, came up with the shampoo headrest. Any of these we're mentioning now, if you want patent numbers for it, we can go back over and give it to you again. When you talk about George Beckett, we're talking about the letterbox, the mailbox, which of course we're presently using. We're talking about the making of flags. We always think about Betsy Ross, of course. Well, she made the American flag. But the making of flags itself, the patent, no matter who had thought about it before, the patent for doing it was granted to a black man, H.A. Bowman. C.B. Brooks came up with the street sweeper. Now, I'm not talking about, again, the ones using the straw. I'm talking about the automatic street sweeper, the kind that was using electrical engines and all for it. Steam sweeper, again. Talking again about C.B. Brooks. They say that African Americans and black people don't keep up lawns, so therefore there would be no reason for them to invent the lawnmower, but I guess in his spare time to help his master or something he must have, because the patent granted to the lawnmower inventor was to a J.A. Burr. J.A. Burr. For the train alarm systems, not just the train alarm, but the train alarm system, R.A. Butler. For self-setting animal traps, William Campbell. For steam traps, Henry Creamer. For riding saddles, W.D. Davis. Now, when I say riding saddles, I don't mean that he invented all the saddles ever used, but he invented so many special types of saddles for different persons. If they were long or short, tall, if they wanted to ride side saddle, if they wanted to, they even had one that could be used over two horses, which he used to just give to some of their pony riders and trick riders. Again, if you wanted a saddle, you went again to W.D. Davis. The shoes now that have ventilations in them. Now, we first of all had John Ernst Montzelliger giving you the shoe lasting machine, but now we have H. Faulkner ventilating those shoes in the summertime. You got the idea, well, hey, it got too hot, especially in the South, so you ought to have air circulating through them, so he came up with ventilated shoes and patented it. F.J. Farrell came up with the valves for the steam engine. Do you think that's important? Valves for the steam engine? Can you think of how steam engines would work now without valves? And yet something like that just goes by in history. The valves for all steam engines granted a patent to F.J. Farrell. In fact, he didn't even do that until 1890, by the way. Gregory Graham, I guess, is responsible for the Great Pan Am Open, because he came up with what is called the golf tee. Anybody ever heard of that before? When they're teeing off, they nodded and just jaw between each other in the head. Foot power hammer, a man by the name of N. Heaton, M. Heaton, H-E-A-D-N. Something as simple as an egg beater, which we take for commonplace, common knowledge now. William Johnson, the egg beater. Breadcrumbs, well, you know, they package them now, and the person that came up with a breadcrumbing machine was J. Lee. I have no idea what J stands for. J. Lee, L-E-E. Lubrication for the steam engines, as I told you, was Elijah McCoy, and as I also pointed out, he had some 35 other patents for different types of lubrications, and that was between 1872 and 1899. And can you imagine where the present technological status would be if there was no way to lubricate engines and devices by which almost all of our technology is based on. And he was so inventive and such a genius to lubricate these machines. He just thought almost any kind of machine they came up with, he figured out a way to get it lubricated. And he's the one that 35 different patents for lubricating devices was granted to one man. 35 different ways to lubricate machines. For fertilizer distributor, the automatic one, G.W. Murray. For the paper bag machine, and of course Bemis Bag Company probably put everybody to rest, but W.B. Purvis, the Purvis bag was one of the first bags that the United States had, and and he patented the use of just a plain paper bag. Now you know what an industry that is. And I always think about Bemis bag without ever knowing that W.B. Purvis just said, hey, let's just make something to put this food into. Clothes dryer, G.T. Sampson, the automatic clothes dryer. Potato digger, P.D. Smith. A basic thing like the lemon squeezer, plain lemon squeezer, J.T. White. The fire escape ladder, and especially the counter span, the one that comes down under weight, cantilever process once it gets to the end, and hooking it on to the actual fire escape, all of those patents are granted to a black man, J.R. Winters. J.R. Winters. I want to save the probably best for last, because I mentioned this on a couple of programs. I do my research first, and then I try to wait for an opportune time, because what I find is, in not copywriting or patenting also, a lot of the things that I state I hear other people use, which is good, but I want to use this one at a special occasion. And you'll probably hear this more and more coming up now. We're told that in 1903, the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, near Dayton, invented the first flying machine. And that first flying machine went a total of 120 feet and flew for 12 seconds. And that is supposedly then the start of the flying machine. Now, you know from last week I showed you birds, archaeological dig birds, birds with swept-back wings and double passenger seatings and so on like that. But those, of course, cannot be proven, and its inventors cannot be proven. But listed again, the patent number 643795. I repeat, United States Patent Office issued February 20th, 1900. February 20th, 1900, patent number 643795 to J.F. Pickering for the first airship. The airship flew 100 yards and stayed up close to 2.5 minutes. The Wright brothers flew 120 feet, stayed up 12 seconds. 3 years before that time, J.F. Pickering was flying. And in fact, it was stated, and this I can't back up for sure, but I'll give you the rumor that I'm still trying to research, is that he had a little town near Tennessee that he flew this ship, and he'd been doing it for almost 1.5 years, and the mayor of the town had banned him from flying that daggone contraption or trying to fly before he killed his fool self anywhere near the city. And so he said he wouldn't fly it near the city, he was going to fly it over the city. And one time, supposedly, he did sail with this daggone thing over the city, ran up and crashed into a river over there and almost killed himself. And this was all before the time when he finally made this successful one. That, of course, was a flight of miles, but they didn't consider that a success until the one flew that didn't crash but actually landed. How many people ever heard of a J.F. Pickering? One person. This is why I'm saying again, and they ask, why Black history and why the need to study it? Those are just some of the inventions. I'm sure that I haven't named half of them. Oh, I did forget also the overshoe, and that was by A.L. Richmond. And I understand too that the dustpan and the mop. I just don't have the men's names right now. It just goes on and on and on. So if anybody ever questions you again about what has the black man given to the world or this society, you can begin to say, I don't have time right now, but if you want to study with me a couple of hours, we can begin to talk about it. Or you can begin to relate some of the ones that you've heard today. So much for inventions by black people. Before we move on, there are any questions or comments on that section? Yes? I just want to give your first name if you like, if not, fine.
Gary. You mentioned George Washington Carver. You said his real name was Twain Carver.
Yes, George Twain Carver.
George Twain Carver?
Yeah.
Do you know what Twain means? Does it have a meaning?
It does, and I am not sure. I think he was named after somebody else, and I don't know that full story. I was just surprised when I learned that Washington was kind of given to him later on. He took that for some reason, some identification with George Washington himself. He thought this person was a good person. As I say, to me, he was so naive in some things and so brilliantly genius in others. Just the things of a man that was genius. He contacted his creator and the creator worked through him.
A couple of there's a book that's on the celebration of history, what history is. It's six books together that I have to remind Jewel in 7th Street. And one in there is the Inventors and escapes me now. So the ice cream scoop was invented by a black person and also an Army boy. I was also kind of surprised that that book because of the initial, it appears that there's the other side of that woman I was looking at. There, other than the stretching cone and Army boy, I don't think there were a lot of marriage.
Very good, and I need to find it because I've tried to find one invention outside of Madam C.J. Walker, of course.
The Army, I believe it's the Army boy, I'm not sure. And the reason I remember that because I thought, wouldn't it be like a woman to invent something like that?
Thank you. Yeah, I've seen that section up there, little handbooks that they have, the jewels and all like that. Yeah, I agree.
On the bulletin board here, about 2 weeks ago, it's been changed now.
The invention of black women, or yeah. Okay. As I state, and not only that, but all the ones that did inventings or inventions before 1834 were never even granted patents. Questions or comments about the invention portion?
Well, hydrogen was another one. Where we were taught history.
But we know
Uh,
it's with
Yeah, Eli Whitney is the one given credit, and I can't find the rumor was that there was a slave who worked on it there, and the slave, of course, was not granted the patent. He used to use this thing to speed up his ability to harvest cotton without hurting his hand and getting all these little thumb pricks, and he took it and improved on it and patented the patent. But of course, I can't get the name or approval of that. Eli Whitney, of course, some people said Eli Whitney, of course, was black, but no, he wasn't.
And the article I read about the Pickering, who the first supposed to across everything. I don't think it mentioned he was black, but I want to look at it and see, because now I'm interested. I may not have read it as closely as I would had I known, had I had any idea.
Okay, any others? Or all right, let's move on to another section of history, if you will, and that is in the Americas and what is called the old mountain men, the cowboys, the pony soldiers, and the buffalo soldiers. Our early American history of the late 1700s and early 1800s and late 1800s is replete, of course, with the people who made, as they say, the Old West, the colonists who cut their hewed out a living and a place out of just brush and shrubbery and so on like this, and plains. And we usually, in the movie pictorials, we find two men usually playing most of the cowboys and heroes of the Old West. Usually it's Charlton Heston and Errol Flynn. Okay. Now, because of this, we have well, sometimes that's doing Randolph Scott and maybe somebody else, but those are the main ones. So it puts a mentality into youngsters' minds, whether they be brown, black, yellow, or white, that this is the way these guys were. They were upright, they were adventurers, they were courageous, and so on like this. And in most cases, we find deleted completely the Afro-American in any of this. So I want to go through, first of all, starting with what are called cowboys, give you a definition of that, and then give you some parts of history that maybe you know, and then maybe a few of them you hadn't heard before. When we say cowboy, we're talking about a man, generally, young man. It could range anywhere from 17 to about 25. The longevity of these early people was not past 39. And most of them were either full of lung disease or whooping cough or tuberculosis or cancer or something by the time they were 35 because of how they lived and what they lived on. But these These were people who roped cows and who took over long trails, herds of cattle and cows like this. And a few of them, of course, were very good with horses, and they had what they call bronc busters, picket men, and so on like this. The mountain man was a man who lived away from this coming civilization, who understood the natives of that land, which we now call the Indians, who could live off of the raw forest itself, understanding roots and herbs and how to skin and kill and fish and whatever else was necessary. So we hear about mountain men. The chief mountain man in history, the one everybody toned up to, was Jim Beckwourth. And Jim Beckwourth was an Afro-American. Jim Beckwourth. And there are many stories that we go into about Jim Beckwourth, but now let's just say Jim Beckwourth was your big mountain man, one of the best known in history. Word, yeah, W-R-T-H, Woolworth. There's a story told about a bronc buster. A bronc buster was one who broke to saddle what they called wild ponies and horses, and they were called broncos. Jesse Stahl, S-T-A-H-L, Jesse Stahl, was one of the most notorious bronc busters the history has to say, because he got so good at his craft that he was making all kind of money as he was breaking sometimes 20 and 30 horses a day, which was unheard of by one man, and making the money profits from it. To go along with the bronc busters are pony riders. And pony riders were those who used to run into competitions riding these ponies after they broke them before they would sell them to somebody. They sometimes raced them because these horses were very spirited, and they'd make money on the side seeing whose bronc that was recently busted could be ridden the fastest. This led to a legend that we have not understood, and that was the first Pony Express riders. Now, we're usually told that Carlton Heston and Randolph Scott and Errol Flynn were the first Pony Express riders. We understand how that concept comes through, but definitely we know that these were Caucasian people that rode this Pony Express. Pony Express was a way of getting a message from the eastern provinces, which were called the 13 colonies, all the way to the westward people who were always making treks to go and open up what they call the western frontiers of the United States. So to keep up with what was going on and to keep up with the mail, since they didn't have aircraft carriers and planes flying and so on and so forth again, they had what they called a means to get them there by people riding very hard, very fast, night and day, to keep up with the outskirts, outposts, all the way back to so-called civilization. To do this, they had links between way stations and fresh ponies that were there. Some of these were in very harsh territories. These men would sometimes ride 13 hours a day with very little rest, come in and sleep, and then as they slept over, the next man would go on carrying his message. These were called the Pony Express riders. The first two Pony Express riders were George Monroe and William Robinson, both Afro-Americans. George Monroe and William Robinson. There were those who were called range riders. Range riders were those who could follow a trail through snow, follow a trail through sand that blew over, follow a trail through forest, and of course the first trails were not carved out and asphalt poured through the deserts and through the forest and so. And to be able to pick up a trail and follow a trail and guide wagons through it and provisions through it was a gift. And one of the most notorious, well not notorious in this case, one of the most famous of the range riders was a man by the name of Bill Pickett. And what he used to do, he would sometimes stake out very harsh areas and put little flags on them, or sometimes try flowers on them or so, to let people know that this was a way through a trail. Sometimes a trail would take off the beaten path maybe by 600 or 700 yards, with people who get lost. And because of these sticking these little wooden things in there, they began to say that these were pickets. And you've heard the term picket fence? That's your origin. He used to say that these were pickets, because Pickett had left these things there stuck into the ground. Again, so many things in history we just never seem to hear. We hear about, of course, famous gunfighters, and we still go see that, for the Magnificent Seven and Yul Brynner, and those the other guy's name, well, you know what I'm saying again. All the way, of course, to Billy the Kid, Bill Bonning, and all these people. But you don't hear, by the way, too, it's stated that Billy the Kid, Bill Bonning, shot 7 men in the back, and used to be notorious for having a back shooter, way shooter. Somebody on the side, that when the man was directed toward him, the guy would shoot him. Now, all these things are in history books, too, but they're laughed at and talked about, and of course, they're glorified as called for what they call heroes of the Old West. But a man who they didn't have to glorify and who you never see hardly in any of the movies was a man by the name of Cherokee Bill. And if you go for people who can draw fast and shoot you down, well, Cherokee Bill was very proficient at this. Cherokee Bill was hung at the age of 19, so you know when his career must have been. By that time, he had killed 16 men. And it was stated that he loved to go up against the man single-handedly because he felt he was just that fast and that good. Cherokee Bill was part African and part Cherokee, and was considered a very good-looking man. And the way he got in trouble was because women seemed to think he was too, and he didn't care whose woman seemed to have thought that. Wife or girlfriend, mother, daughter, it didn't matter to him. And a lot of men didn't like Cherokee Bill. So when they finally surrounded him in Oklahoma Territory in 1896, they refused to kill him. They had him surrounded, they wounded him. But they said they wanted to take him back to make an example of this man so that no man would do this again. So they wanted to lynch him in broad daylight before lots of people. So of course, having spent the night wounded, awaiting his death in the morning, he was very weak. And when they brought him up, they asked him, did he wish now to take back and to beg for his life and to take back what he'd done? He said, again, I came here to die, not to make a speech. Go on with your hanging. And that was the last words from Cherokee Bill. So I'm sure that would make quite a movie, but I haven't seen it yet. When we talk about women in the Old West, probably the most famous again was Mary Fields. And she lived about 1884 in Montana. She was born in Tennessee and raised as a slave. She killed her master and escaped, and started off therefore with a reputation. When she got to free country, she bought her own freedom and was never taken back. But she was a very tall woman for the time, 6 feet still would be, and a very heavy-set woman. She was an Afro-American, and was known to fight a man, as they say, at the drop of a hat, and to pull a gun on a man or a woman, or they even said a beast. They said she had a mean streak. Okay? But what she was noted for was something that happened, again, in the Cascade Mountains of Montana, and this happened seemingly about 1879. There were some Ursuline nuns in the Cascade Mountains in a nunnery, and it had been some vicious snowstorms that had cut off the trails, and most people were afraid to take this trek up to get them provisions. And one man had gone up there halfway, and it stated that there were a lot of wolves on the trail, and he just had to come back, but that the snowstorm was bad, and if they didn't get some provisions up to them within the next 48 hours, they would probably die. So it was Mary Fields who said that she would do it alone for enough money. And they paid her a tremendous amount of money, and she took, again, some pack mules. She had one lead horse and a pull pony, and 2 rifles and 2 side guns and a lot of bandoliers full of ammunition and stuff. And she started off with a dog, which she always kept with her, a trusty police dog, I guess. And they started up to go to these Ursuline nuns. Well, the story went, and I'm dragging all this out, but I'll try to make it brief. Up on the trail, not only did she encounter a snowstorm, but she encountered a wolf pack. And the wolf pack almost did her in. It seemed like these wolves attacked at night, and by the next morning, the wolves had killed one of her ponies, had killed her dog, had slit the throat of one of the pack mules, and she, in turn, had slain one of the other mules, and drugged this carcass around to leave a blood trail so that the wolves would follow this blood trail, and had killed seemingly some 20 wolves by that time. Had not been able to get to her side gun before one of the wolves attacked her, and had gone hand to hand with the wolf, getting her arm sliced by his teeth, and had cut the wolf's throat. Still went on, delivered the provisions to the Ursuline nuns and had to stay there for 3 days before she almost bled to death. But some way or another she fought through and came back to civilization. That I'm sure also would make for quite an interesting movie about a black woman, Mary Fields. And I guess 2 stories I'll end with on this one, although I want to throw out to you too. We hear about the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. And of course that's also with Randolph Scott or Earl Flynn or so on again. I guess that was of course between Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton boys. Well, what's interesting is that with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were 4 Afro-Americans that fought with them. They had seemingly had an indebtedness to Morgan Earp, Wyatt Earp's brother, who had helped to free one of them and helped them in a situation when he was sheriff. And when they found it was going to be a showdown, they came there and stood with them. And with the Clanton were 6 black men. And I understand that they didn't stand up and shoot it down along the sidewalk. That they were running all day long in and out of the hills and down in gully troughs and going into shop dens, as they call it. It was quite a messy fight, and the people were scared and cursing because they couldn't come out all day as these fools shouted out. But nevertheless, there were 6 black men with the Clantons, and there were 4 with Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp. To go to another part of history, and then I'll cease on this part. There was a person that's known as Deadwood Dick, and you still hear a lot of the kids run through the street talking about Deadwood Dick. Usually it comes out Dead-Eye Dick. But Dead-Eye Dick is a very hard history to follow. But the closest historians come now is that it must have been a person, or probably, they're pretty about 90% pure, that it was a man by the name of Nathaniel Love, simply called Nat Love. And his fame, he was notorious as a cowboy, panhandler, and a range rider. And the story states that there was something called the Home Stakes. And the Home Stakes took place, of course, on the 4th of July in honor of the reason. And on July 4th, 1876, this particular Home Stakes event is what made history. Seemingly, there's a lot of cowboys that come in the night before, and there was one of these pony soldiers, the soldiers who were barricaded and brigaded up around the town, and one of the men was being lashed for something that he had done. And Nat Love saw this man being lashed, rode up and used his lariat to jerk the gun out of the, the lariat out of the man's hand. And then while 2 of the cowboys held a gun on this private, whoever it was whipping him, they let this other man loose and pulled him down about 100 yards and then dropped him on the trail. Well, of course, the Army didn't particularly like that, but there were so many cowboys coming in for these home state games that they felt if they did anything to this particular one, who was kind of infamous, that it might have been a riot there. So they were particularly interested in being competitive. And so they also joined in the home states games, which was uncalled for, unheard of at that time, when you had some of the Army riflemen taking place in what they call the shootouts. At the home states games, they had panhandling games and so on and so forth, but the biggest competition came with the weaponry for the rifle and the side gun. They also had what they call bronc busting and roping and so on like this. What Nathaniel Love became famous for was that he won the 100-yard rifle shoot, and he won the 250-yard rifle shoot. And only 4 men even entered into the 250-yard rifle shoot, because out of about 30 that entered into the 100-yard rifle shoot, most of them saw what they were up against and backed off. And he won that. Then they had what they call the bullseye shot, and they just kept backing the bullseye further and further away. They started off 10 feet away, and they backed it almost to, I think it was about 80 feet away. And the one that he won, he put in 12 shots out of 15 shots into the bullseye. So with this, he was given the name, of course, since it happened in Deadwood territory, at the home state, he was called Deadwood Dick. And that's another one probably would make a history movie. Last but not least, I want to share this with you, simply because this is another one of history's farces. We're told that the Rough Riders were the cream of the crop in the late 1800s. In the Spanish-American War, we're told that Teddy Roosevelt, who later on was Theodore Roosevelt, of course, who was made president of the United States, was made famous because of what he called his Rough Riders. These were men who were not enlisted men, men who were simply from all walks of life but were good on horses and good at shooting. That Teddy Roosevelt could band together and said he could outshoot and outride any of the regular cavalry. And so the Rough Riders went on doing tales of daring do. The most daring do that they did was to ride up what is called San Juan Hill. And the famous Rough Riders charge up San Juan Hill to defeat the Spanish, of course, is legendary. The only trouble is it's not true. And what research has shown is that when Teddy Roosevelt did indeed ride up San Juan Hill and almost got wiped out, for there was a garrison of Spanish armadiers behind the next hill, and before he could get down the hill, they cut him off and they were entrapped. And little by little, his Rough Riders were being picked off. The word got out to the 9th Cavalry, and the 9th Cavalry galloped in, joined by parts of the 10th Cavalry, and took all of that to get rid of all those soldiers to get Teddy Roosevelt off the hill. And what's interesting is there's a book by the name of The Old West by William Lorenz Katz. The Old West by William Lorenz Katz. And when they first got Teddy Roosevelt off the hill with parts of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, it was stated that, and I see if I can find this direct quote from him, after the battle, euphoric Roosevelt said of the black troopers, they can drink out of our canteens anytime. So I guess that was a big privilege, I don't know. But what he stated was that, you know, they didn't mind drinking after black men because they were so honored. 4 months later, it was, well, they were part of it, but we noticed that they had a peculiar desire to drop to the rear, and were it not for their white commander, who knows what they would have done. And a year later it was, well, we were going to come off anyway, and we understand that they were around. So it's very interesting, again, from euphoric admiration drinking out of his canteen to maybe they were around, which is the real story behind the famous charge of San Juan Hill. They don't tell you again how they got off the hill. And that's another one I think that bears a lot of interest, and I doubt if we ever see that in a movie. It could again go on and on. Could bring it up to date, of course, with, they did a program not too long ago on the Black Airmen, also the Congressional Honor, Medal of Honor winners, and during the war between England and America, and later on, of course, the war between the states, there have been so many instances of gallantry and bravery by Afro-Americans that it's almost too many to count. Even what is interesting, too, that Britain hired, when the war was going so badly against them here in America, they hired what they call Hessian soldiers. These were German soldiers who came over here. And they hired amongst these German soldiers a whole detachment of some 1,000 Germans who were of African ancestry. And that's very interesting too, because that meant that you had with the Hessians fighting here, who were called Germans, there were many black men fighting with them. And we hear, of course, of the famous battle at Bunker Hill. Anybody have never heard of Bunker Hill before? Again, we hear about the battle, we don't hear about the details. And Bunker Hill reminds me so much of the infamous Hamburger Hill in Vietnam, when men just fought for a little higher piece of ground, which on a normal, you know, sane concepts would mean nothing. But since so many men had died at Bunker Hill, it became just like Hamburger Hill, was something to take, because it was just a matter of the principle then. The honor of whoever took it would probably have the moral victory and would be discouraged, would discourage the other troops. So when we look at again at Bunker Hill, the reason why it was won was because there was a British major by the name of Pitcairn, Pitcairn. And Pitcairn was very valorous. He did not go where his men did not go, and he was the glue that held these men together as they lost thousands of men over a week's time in this stupid little piece of hill. So there was a final assault by the American brigade up this hill to the top of it, and Major Pitcairn was slain. When he was slain, the troops became demoralized, and that's what led to the victory of the Americans at Bunker Hill, and that's what led to a total the biggest battle probably that turned the whole phase of the war. What they don't talk about, again, was that the man leave you with that one hanging. My mind just went, Peter Salem, that was it. Peter Salem was a man that shot, again, Major Bitcoin. When we just look at history, period, you will always find the Afro-American taking place in the fighting, the Afro-American taking place in the digging, the Afro-American taking place in invention, and even into what we call landholders. Through history, we've had many Afro-Americans who have held high office. We've had some post and pre-Reconstruction, and most of these have been forgotten. We've had some 12 senators that were of African ancestry. We've had some 20 congressmen that were of African ancestry. We've had 3 lieutenant governors, and presently 291 and a half mayors. And I say that because, of course, our present mayor is acting mayor, but yet the man died and the man replacing was still Afro-Americans. So all of this would let you know that the history of the United States has been bad, but since there are no present senators that are Afro-Americans, it's obviously been maybe better at one time than another, as we now stand. But what is still a hard claw to swallow for any person who's prejudiced, and for people who just are not even prejudiced, but just don't seem to think that a Afro-American has the ability to run large industries and large countries, is the idea when I get into what's called the 6 black presidents. And 3 of these men were named by J.A. Rogers, again, the person who I still say is, to me, one of the best historians for African history. And really, if you really get in detail, probably for anybody's history, because he was so, researched so well the African history that he also exposed a lot of other history. But if you read his book, The 5 Negro Presidents, you'll find that he does not name 5, he names 3, and alludes to 2 others, and very little in this present copyright edition to give you too much lead to find them. I state that there's 6, and they run like this. The first one was Thomas Jefferson. His mother was part Indian. His grandfather, on his mother's side, was a mulatto from Shadwell, Virginia. Now, understand, too, I guess some basic statistics ought to be set up. Mulatto, octoroon, Negro, colored, Moor, African, Afro-American, all different ways of saying a person with black skin, a person generally what they stated at that time was from Africa. And this is based on an idea given by a man by the name of Blumenbach, who in the beginning of the 17th century made a statement. He stated that if anyone had less than 0.1% non-white blood, they'd be considered a Negro. Now, all of these people had maybe a half a pint, or a pint, or a quart, or a tenth. I don't know what division you want to give on the liquid scale, but they had a lot. Okay, we move into our next person. And by the way, too, if you remind me, I want to tell you a story about Blumenbach, which I think fits very easily into black history. And I'll probably forget it. Somebody can remember to say, you know, at the end of this class tonight, to say, tell us a little story about Blumenbach, I'd like to share it with you. Next one is Warren Harding. Warren Harding. His father is considered a Caucasian, George Tyrone Harding, not Tyrone, but Tyrone, T-Y-R-O-N, Harding. But his grandmother, Elizabeth Madison, was an Afro-American woman. Elizabeth Madison, his grandmother. He had a sister by the name of Heber Votaw, and if you listen to the name, you'd feel that there'd be no black blood. But as I stated before, in history, you cannot go by the person's name to find the color of the skin. That's ridiculous. It's too misleading, and it doesn't work. But Heber Votaw was also considered a black woman. She lived, taught, and raised children in the black community. And she was a great-great-grandmother of Elizabeth Harding, also another Negro. So you had 2 black bloodlines into Warren Harding. And most of the people were quite aware of that at the time, especially from around the area that he lived. But it is in the election of 1920 when they tried to make a big escapade of this by losing the election by declaring him to be a Negro. And that's when this famous pamphlet that you can't even find now called Warren Harding Negro was first published. And what happened was that it worked against the person, and most people don't even remember who ran against him at that time. His name was Keka Cox. Keka Cox, K-E-K Cox. And he was so defeated, it was one of the most one-sided elections of all time in the United States. And then after the election, they took all those books, put them on railroad cars behind the White House and burned them. And they had cars standing around this big bonfire and took 2 railroad cars full. That shows you how much literature had to be collected. Next is Calvin Coolidge. And Calvin Coolidge was born in Virginia. He was part Blackfoot, and I can't find out what else, but Blackfeet are known to have been largely miscegenated with Afro-Americans. And he never really, he's one of the only ones that stood up and was very proud of his heritage. Now, Warren Harding was proud of it because of the people that knew him, but he didn't really go on record. If you found out about it, okay. And as I say, the big scandal was when they tried to make a big issue about it. And he had said before, well, we never denied it, but we just didn't make an issue. We didn't think it really was that important if I was capable. But Calvin Coolidge would brag about his. And Calvin Coolidge even established what was called the Nordic Society for Mixed Indians. And that was in Virginia in the late 20s. And that can be easily researched because the name was so unique, the Nordic Society, because he really was a student of history and had a reason for calling it that. And grew a lot of ire because of his ostentatious stand on having so-called African blood. The hardest one to prove is Andrew Jackson. That's the one that gets me in more trouble. But until somebody can show me where I'm wrong, I'm going to stick to my guns, and I've went on 48 states with it, and nobody has got to me yet. They just fussed about it. Andrew Jackson's mother and father are both said to be Caucasians, Irish from Ireland. And as I do research, I find that his father was said to be a black Irish, or mulatto, from, was it some little verb, I forget what it is now. But that is not where I'm stealing it from, because I still haven't got enough information on that one. But that is a point for research if any of you wish to take up the gavel there. The black blood possibly his father from Ireland. But he was born on the Crawford farm in the state of Virginia, 14 months after his father died. And there were no white men on the farm. To give more legitimacy to this, his oldest brother, who is said to have the same mother and father, was sold as a slave in the state of South Carolina. And it was he who tried valiantly finally to get his brother released from slave bondage. So that's the way I leave that one for whatever it's worth. You understand the 14-month category, right? Gestation period? Alexander Hamilton was not a president of the United States. I'm well aware of that, but I throw him in because I think that since he is so famous in history and was Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, that you should understand his heritage, because there's a lot of escapades that Alexander Hamilton got into that you might appreciate more now if you study his history, understanding that he also had Afro-American blood. He was, well, Afro-West Indian blood, if you would. He was born in the British West Indies on the island of Nevis, Nevis. His mother was Rachel Fawcett, F-A-W-C-E-T-T, a mixed West Indian. His brother was James Hamilton, who was registered as a mixed blood or a Negro. And they both had the same mother and father. And I think it makes for very interesting history, as I say, if you really read some of the stories of Alexander Hamilton. The last two, one is Abraham Lincoln. And people say, oh, I should have known that. Now I know why he freed the slaves. That was not why he freed the slaves. In fact, he tried his best. He was so hurt by his heritage that the last thing he really wanted, I think, was to be black or Afro-American, but yet he was. And the whole story of his father and his hard life, again, can be understood if you hear this little story with him. There were two Abraham Lincolns. The first one was killed by Indians in 1786, and he was a scoundrel. He had raped and killed and every other thing. Again, he didn't seem to like men or women. And he had, I'm sure, a lot of babies, but I'm interested in one of his babies whose name was Thomas Lincoln. Thomas Lincoln was an antithesis. He was just the opposite of his father and was very freewheeling. I guess you would say he was like a hippie type. He got along well with everybody. He traveled a lot and lived off the land and was seemingly known by a lot of people. He married Sarah Thomas Lincoln, middle name after her father, because he was proud to have a offspring. And of course, everyone knew that when he finally had a son, if ever, that he'd be super proud. So he called his daughter after himself, Thomas Lincoln, but her first name, of course, was Sarah. But when his son was born, he called him Abraham. It was a denunciation because he had heard that the first Jew was Abraham, and he considered him an outcast. He considered him illegitimate. And he had very little to do with him and held empathy between his wife because he said that it was not his son, but that it was the son of a mulatto slave on the farm, and that he was her paramour. And he was very jealous and angry about it, and so much so that a peculiar thing was done. As you remember, after he hewed out this log cabin out of the wilds and so and stayed there for about 8 or 9 months, and then the family journeyed. If you read the history, people couldn't understand why he journeyed. And they said, well, he went to a better place. Well, in truth, I found out that he moved about 8 miles. And that was unheard of for a man to build a castle, say, or his home right here, and then move 8 miles away. At that time, people just didn't do that. If you were going to move, you might have gone to another state or to the opposite end of the state. You didn't move just 8 miles. But what he did was to move from the Elizabethtown Nolan River Farm to Knob Creek. And in so doing, he moved across a creek, which was live at the time. It wasn't a bed, it was an active creek. And the law of the land said that a slave could not cross an open body of water, could be killed on sight if so did. And consequently, he supposedly put thin distance between the wife's lover or paramour and his family. Either way, any son born to Nancy Hanks and Abraham Lincoln would have had to have had African blood. And many of the stories, there's a story that is told about Hannibal Hamlin, who was the vice president, who was accosted of being a very dark-skinned person. And on many occasions he said, but yes, but I'm not even half as dark as the president. And if you see some of the old pictures of Lincoln, he not only was very tall, but had a very, very broad nose and very thick underlip. And many of the people, of course, refer to him in many cases under their breaths, of course, as being a Negro and so on like this. The last one I save for last. And I do this because of the place in history that this man holds. And what he did was to state that the armies of the United States would be denigrated if ever a Negro were drafted into its service, simply because they could not serve with distinction, they could not be valorous, that they were of a lower class line anyway, and he would rue the day when blacks were allowed to come into the United States services. Well, blacks did and had for some time, but I always find that interesting because in doing further research, I find that when you hear about the story of Emmett Till, which is irony, it seems like there's forces that laugh at us on this planet, and sometimes we don't see the irony and humor of it. Anybody remember Emmett Till? And the story of his hanging and so-called raping of a white woman or something like this, and all he did was go to the store and got money at the wrong place at the right time. Well, Emmett Till's father was hung in France by this particular president for having had sex with a French woman who was white. And isn't that irony of history? And I don't hear that being brought out a lot. The man's name was Dwight David Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower. And I have as your parting token the cover of the magazine for which the article of this history is run, and then the picture is not the best, but you can still tell the features of his mother and father on their wedding day in 1893. And I'll pass it out to you as part of your gift for having taken the course itself. This history, dissertation, presentation could run on and on and on because the Afro-American is still making history in this country. There was recently a contract granted I forget the man's name right off, for the making of 8 cruisers, or the building, turned out to be a building of 1 cruiser, and then they did it at such a rapid rate of speed of time, and it was so well that the contract for 7 other cruisers, both heavy and light cruisers, was granted to a black firm out on the West Coast. And there are now Afro-Americans building airplanes for not only the United States government, but for some of the big airlines. And it just goes on and on. You know, mostly in Chicago alone, just all the businesses that Afro-Americans are into. And there's hardly any area of commerce or industry or agriculture that the Afro-American does not take part in. The only problem is that he usually does not get credit for it, and of course has to run up against all of the opposition that is innate and insane enough in this country for racial prejudice. I hope that some of those things and the course itself was of interest to you, and one way you can let me know, not by applause, although I love that too, but you tell others about the course. Right now, we're not going to start another course here in Black history because there's not enough people interested. And that still always amazes me. We did some phone calling over the weekend, and those few people who had missed the first one and said they were interested, only 3 out of 16 calls were still interested in taking it. So, if you know others that may be interested in it, you might either refer them by my number and have them to call me or some of the other representatives, or if you know some churches or Masonic organizations or schools or block clubs or whichever that might be interested in Black history seminars or so, please let us know about it, and please let them know about the classes that are taught. Okay? And as I told you, I'm going to pass this sheet out to you so don't forget it. Oh, and I also asked you to remind me about so you want to better